Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore the emotional journey of a former millionaire CEO who abandoned the city, lost everything he once built, and discovered true peace while living as a simple farmer in the mountains. But what happened when people from his old life suddenly came back and asked him the one question he could no longer avoid? Are you really happier now? Stay with me until the end, because this powerful story might completely change the way you think about success, money, and happiness. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. The rainstorm passed during the night, but the mountains still carried the smell of wet soil and broken leaves the next morning. Triệu Khang stepped outside the small wooden house before sunrise, pulling his old jacket tighter against the cold wind drifting through the bamboo forest. Thin layers of mist floated across the hills, while drops of water continued falling from the roof onto the muddy ground beneath his feet. The storm had left the entire mountainside quiet, almost frozen in place. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the garden behind the house. Several bamboo supports had collapsed during the heavy rain. Parts of the vegetable rows were flooded, and broken branches from the lychee orchard lay scattered across the hillside. Weeks earlier, seeing all that damage would have frustrated him deeply. Back then, he still carried traces of the old life inside him. The constant need to control outcomes, fix problems immediately, and push harder whenever something failed. But life in the mountains had slowly changed the way he looked at hardship. Without saying a word, Triệu Khang picked up a shovel, leaning against the porch, and walked toward the damaged garden. The muddy soil sank beneath his boots as he carefully cleared water away from the vegetable beds. Cold wind brushed against his face, while his hands worked silently rebuilding the collapsed supports one by one. Hours passed that way. No phone calls interrupted him, no meetings waited, no investors demanded explanations, only the sound of wind, water, and tools moving against wet earth. At some point during the morning, sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds above the valley. The bamboo leaves reflected soft golden light, while steam rose gently from the soaked ground. Triệu Khang paused for a moment and looked across the mountains, stretching endlessly beyond the orchard. There was a strange peace, hidden inside exhaustion now. Years earlier, after working an entire day in the office, he usually returned home mentally destroyed. His body sat still, but his mind never stopped running. Even while eating dinner, he thought about contracts. Even while lying in bed, he worried about investments and debt. Rest had become impossible because pressure followed him everywhere. But here, physical exhaustion felt honest. When the work ended, his mind finally became quiet. By late afternoon, Triệu Khang finished repairing most of the damaged sections of the garden. His clothes were covered in mud, and his hands ached from hours of labor. Still, looking at the rebuilt rows of vegetables gave him a kind of satisfaction he rarely experienced during his years as a CEO. Back in the city, achievements disappeared quickly. One successful project only led to larger expectations. One financial milestone created pressure for another. Nothing ever felt complete, but here, even small progress carried meaning. As the sun lowered behind the mountains, Triệu Khang carried several baskets of vegetables toward the small outdoor sink beside the house. He washed mud from fresh green beans, tomatoes, and pumpkin flowers, while cold water flowed across his rough hands. Nearby, the repaired garden moved gently beneath the evening wind. Then suddenly, the sound of an engine broke the silence. Triệu Khang slowly turned toward the narrow dirt road leading up the mountain. A black SUV stopped near the bamboo trees beside the house. For a second, he simply stared at it quietly. Nobody from the city had visited since he left. The vehicle door opened, and a man, wearing an expensive gray coat, stepped out onto the muddy road. Even from a distance, Triệu Khang recognized him immediately. Min Quan, one of his former business partners. The man looked completely out of place standing there among the wet soil and bamboo forest. His polished shoes sank slightly into the mud while he glanced around at the old wooden house and vegetable garden with visible disbelief. Triệu Khang remained silent as Min Quan slowly approached. "I still can't believe this is where you live now," Min Quan finally said, while staring around the property. Triệu Khang placed the vegetables into a basket calmly before answering. "What are you doing here?" Min Quan hesitated for a moment. "I wanted to see if the rumors were true." The wind moved quietly through the bamboo trees between them. Months earlier, Triệu Khang would have cared deeply about how people from the city viewed him. He spent years protecting his image, making sure nobody saw weakness behind the expensive suits and confident speeches. But now, standing there covered in dirt beside a half-repaired garden, he felt strangely indifferent. Min Quan slowly looked toward the orchard behind the house. "You really gave up everything for this?" Triệu Khang followed his gaze toward the rows of lychee trees stretching across the hillside. It wasn't much of a choice anymore. The other man laughed quietly, though there was discomfort hidden behind it. "You know people still talk about you, right? Some think you completely lost your mind." Triệu Khang smiled faintly. "That used to bother me." Min Quan studied him carefully, almost as if searching for traces of the ambitious CEO he once knew. But the man standing in front of him now looked entirely different. The expensive watches were gone. The polished appearance had disappeared. Even the tension that once filled Triệu Khang's face no longer existed. Instead, there was something Min Quan couldn't quite understand: calmness. The two men eventually sat outside the wooden house, while the sky slowly darkened above the mountains. Triệu Khang prepared tea using rainwater collected earlier that morning. Steam rose quietly from the cups between them. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then, Min Quan finally lowered his voice. "The company officially collapsed last month." Triệu Khang remained still, even though he expected those words eventually. Hearing them aloud still carried weight. The remaining investors pulled out. The bank seized most of the assets. Min Quan paused before continuing carefully. "Some employees are still angry at you." Triệu Khang stared silently into the steam rising from his tea. Back then, he truly believed sacrificing everything would protect the company. He ignored exhaustion, destroyed relationships, and pushed himself beyond human limits, trying to keep everything alive. Yet in the end, none of it was enough. For years, he blamed himself completely. But somewhere during the quiet months spent in the mountains, his perspective slowly changed. Not everything could be saved forever. Some things collapse no matter how desperately people try holding them together. The city feels different without you, Min Quan admitted quietly. Triệu Khang almost laughed softly at that. The city hadn't needed him. Nobody was truly irreplaceable in that world. Skyscrapers continued rising. Companies continued growing. Meetings still filled office towers every morning. The machine kept moving forward, with or without him. Yet somehow, hearing those words still stirred old memories deep inside him. There was a time when he genuinely loved building things. In the beginning, success wasn't about status or money. He simply wanted to prove himself capable of creating something meaningful. But somewhere along the way, ambition slowly transformed into obsession, and obsession eventually consumed everything else. Min Quan looked around the quiet mountains again before speaking carefully. Do you ever think about coming back? The question lingered heavily between them. Triệu Khang leaned back slightly in the wooden chair, while evening wind moved through the trees surrounding the house. In the distance, insects had already begun echoing across the valley. Months ago, part of him might have answered differently. Part of him still carried guilt, pride, and unfinished attachment to the world he left behind. But now, he looked toward the small garden he rebuilt with his own hands, toward the orchard standing quietly beneath the fading light, toward the old wooden house that once seemed abandoned, but somehow became home again. Then he answered honestly, no. And for the first time since leaving the city, he realized he truly meant it. The mountains became completely dark after Min Quan left. The sound of the SUV engine slowly disappeared down the narrow dirt road, leaving only the wind moving through the bamboo forest surrounding the small wooden house. Triệu Khang remained sitting outside long after the vehicle vanished from sight. The tea beside him had already gone cold, but he barely noticed. The conversation stayed in his mind longer than he expected. For months, he had successfully separated himself from the world he left behind. The city became something distant, almost unreal, like memories belonging to another person. But hearing news about the company again reopened emotions he thought had already disappeared. Failure, regret, guilt. Even now, those feelings still existed somewhere deep inside him. Triệu Khang slowly stood and walked toward the orchard behind the house. The moonlight spread softly across the mountains, while rows of lychee trees moved gently beneath the night wind. The repaired branches from the storm earlier that day looked fragile but steady, tied carefully together with rope and bamboo supports. He stopped beside one of the oldest trees on the hillside and rested his hand against the rough bark. Years ago, his father used to stand in this exact place during harvest season. Back then, Triệu Khang barely paid attention. He was too busy dreaming about escaping the countryside and building a larger life somewhere far away. To him, the mountains represented limitation, poverty, smallness. But now, standing there beneath the quiet night sky, he finally understood something he had missed for most of his life. Peace and success were not the same thing. The realization felt simple now, almost obvious, yet it took losing everything before he could truly understand it. The next morning, Triệu Khang woke before sunrise again. Thin fog covered the mountains, while cold air drifted through the open windows of the wooden house. He prepared a small kettle of tea before walking outside toward the garden. Dew still covered the vegetables, reflecting pale morning light across the hillside. For a while, he worked quietly, trimming damaged leaves and reinforcing the younger plants, weakened by the storm. The physical routine calmed his thoughts. Every movement felt simple and clear. Unlike business meetings where every conversation carried hidden pressure, the land only asked for patience, nothing more. As the morning passed, several villagers slowly arrived at the nearby dirt road, carrying baskets and farming tools on their way toward the market below the mountain. Over the past months, people in the area had gradually become familiar with Triệu Khang's presence. At first, many quietly questioned the strange city man suddenly appearing alone in the countryside. Some believed he wouldn't last more than a few weeks. Others assumed he was hiding from failure. Maybe they were right. But time slowly changed how people looked at him. Now, villagers often greeted him naturally while passing the house. Some occasionally shared seeds, vegetables, or farming advice. Others simply stopped to talk for a few minutes before continuing toward town. That morning, an older farmer named Bak Lam paused beside the fence, holding several small seedlings wrapped carefully in cloth. "I brought these for you," the old man said, while handing them across the fence. Triệu Khang looked down with surprise. "What are they?" "Pepper plants," Bak Lam replied. "They grow well near the hillside, if you care for them properly." Triệu Khang accepted the seedlings slowly. "Thank you." The old farmer studied the garden quietly before nodding with approval. "You've done well here," he said. "The land looks alive again." Those words stayed with Triệu Khang long after the old man disappeared down the road. The land looks alive again. Months earlier, the property truly had looked abandoned. The garden was buried beneath weeds. Broken fences leaned into the mud. The orchard stood neglected for years. At the time, Triệu Khang thought he was rebuilding the farm simply to survive financially. But somewhere along the way, the process became personal. Every repaired fence, every harvested vegetable, every lychee tree brought back to life. Little by little, while rebuilding the land, he had also been rebuilding himself. That afternoon, Triệu Khang carried several baskets of fresh vegetables and lychees down toward the countryside market again. The path leading from the mountain curved through small rice fields and clusters of bamboo houses resting quietly beneath the hills. Unlike the endless noise of the city, the countryside moved slowly. People greeted one another by name. Conversations lasted longer. Nobody rushed. When he arrived at the market, familiar faces already filled the narrow dirt pathways between the stalls. Women arranged vegetables across woven mats, while older farmers carried baskets overflowing with herbs, fruit, and freshly harvested crops. The smell of soil, leaves, and cooked food mixed together beneath the warm afternoon air. Triệu Khang set up his small wooden stall near the same corner where he sold fruit every week. Before long, customers began stopping by. An elderly woman bought lychees for her grandchildren. A young couple purchased fresh vegetables from the garden. A small child pointed excitedly at the bright red fruit stacked neatly inside the bamboo baskets. And for the first time in many years, Triệu Khang realized he genuinely enjoyed talking to people again. Not networking, not negotiating, just simple human conversation. Back in the corporate world, almost every interaction carried purpose, hidden beneath politeness. Relationships often depended on money, influence, or opportunity. But here, conversations felt honest. Nobody cared who he used to be. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, Triệu Khang noticed someone standing near the edge of the market, watching him quietly. A young man wearing office clothes. At first, Triệu Khang barely recognized him. Then suddenly, he remembered one of his former employees. The younger man approached slowly, almost awkwardly. "Mr. Triệu Khang smiled faintly. "You don't work for me anymore," he replied calmly. "You can just call me Triệu Khang." The young man looked around the market in disbelief before speaking. "I heard rumors, but I didn't think they were true." Triệu Khang continued arranging vegetables calmly. "How's the city?" The younger man hesitated before answering honestly. "Still the same." That answer alone somehow explained everything. Still the same. Endless pressure, endless competition, endless exhaustion, disguised as ambition. The young man looked down at the baskets of vegetables and fruit before lowering his voice. "To be honest, sometimes I envy you." Triệu Khang paused slightly. Months earlier, hearing something like that would have felt impossible. People once envied his office, salary, and status. Now, someone envied the quiet life he built among mountains and farmland. The younger employee laughed nervously. "I know it sounds crazy." "No," Triệu Khang answered softly, "it doesn't." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the younger man finally asked the question. Almost everyone from the city eventually asked him, "Are you really happier now?" Triệu Khang looked around the crowded countryside market, at the old farmers laughing nearby, at the fresh vegetables covering the wooden stalls, at the mountains visible beyond the rooftops. Then he smiled quietly. "I'm tired every day," he admitted, "but I'm no longer empty." The younger man fell silent after hearing that. And somehow, those simple words felt more honest than anything Triệu Khang had said during his entire corporate career. After leaving behind his collapsed company and stressful city life, Triệu Khang slowly rebuilt both his abandoned mountain farm and his broken spirit. While violent storms damaged his crops and tested his patience, he discovered a new meaning of strength through simple, daily labor. As he repaired gardens, harvested lychees, and sold vegetables at the countryside market, people from his old corporate world began searching for him again. Former business partners and employees were shocked to find the once powerful CEO living peacefully among mountains and farmland. Many believed he had lost everything, but Triệu Khang finally understood a truth he never learned during his years of success. Money and status could not bring real happiness. Although life in the countryside remained difficult, he no longer felt empty inside. For the first time in years, he felt free, calm, and truly alive again.